On April 16, 2024, a 42-year-old woman named Erica Nunes and her 68-year-old uncle named Paulo Braga arrived at a bank in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro in a cab. Erica got out of the back seat first and then asked the driver to wait so she could go inside the bank to get a wheelchair for her uncle because recently he had been sick with pneumonia in the hospital. She found one in the lobby and then wheeled it back outside. When she got back to the cab, the driver helped her lift her uncle Paulo into the wheelchair, and then afterward, Erica thanked the driver, and then she wheeled her uncle up to the bank, and as she got near the door, a bank attendant came out and opened up the door for them to go inside. Erica smiled at the attendant. Her uncle had been living with her for the past 8 months, and so Erica was pretty accustomed to some level of caretaking, but it had gotten a lot harder recently with her uncle being in the hospital with pneumonia, and so Erica was just exhausted, and so little gestures like this were very appreciated. But despite her exhaustion, today was a really good day for Erica, because her uncle was so appreciative for all the help that he had actually offered to go to this bank with her today and take out a loan for her in his name so she could do some much needed repairs around her house. So Erica and her uncle made their way through the bank towards the front desk and then told the attendant that they needed to see a loan officer. She explained that they had already called ahead and her uncle had been approved for a loan. He was just here now to sign the paperwork. The attendant nodded and then typed a few things on their computer and then came out from behind the desk and led Erica and her uncle to a desk in back to wait for the loan officer. A minute later, when Erica saw the loan officer approaching the desk, she stood up and smiled and was about to say hello, but the loan officer did not smile back. Instead, she just glared at Erica and her uncle in a way that made Erica feel very uncomfortable. And then, instead of shaking their hands, the loan officer just turned around and walked away. Erica looked around in confusion and then sort of sat down awkwardly, feeling worried and also a little annoyed. She turned and watched as this loan officer continued walking away and then stopped next to some employee. She bent down and whispered something in the employee's ear, and Erica watched as this employee's eyes went wide as she heard whatever the loan officer said. And then this loan officer and that employee, they got up and they vanished into a back room of the bank. So now Erica was feeling really weird about all of this. She turned to her uncle and she saw he couldn't even meet her eyes. So she reached out and just began massaging his neck and shoulders. A little while later, the loan officer would come back to the desk, and this time she was carrying this huge stack of papers, and she placed it on the desk in front of Erica's uncle. But instead of sitting down and going over this huge amount of paperwork with them, the loan officer just stood there staring at Erica, and Erica stared right back. And for about 30 seconds, there was just tense silence. And then eventually, the loan officer pulled out her phone and very obviously started filming. And so now Erica went from feeling just uncomfortable to feeling sort of afraid. I mean, this was definitely not normal bank behavior, even for a seemingly very rude employee. But Erica decided to kind of ignore the weirdness and just get her uncle started on the paperwork. But after a few minutes, Erica began to hear the sound of emergency sirens outside the bank. And when she looked up, she saw all these police and first responders running towards her. The video that loan officer shot that day of Erica and her uncle went viral in Brazil. In this video, Erica is seen smiling and attempting to help her uncle sign this paperwork, and she's obviously holding up her uncle's head. But her uncle is not weak from illness. Her uncle is dead. In fact, he had died hours before Erica had brought him to the bank. Now, Erica later claimed that she had no idea her uncle was dead. However, it was very obvious to everyone around her, which is why all the bank employees were acting so strange. Erica was arrested and held for 16 days before being released on bail. She faces charges of abusing a corpse and attempted theft through fraud. Her case has not yet been adjudicated. On the night of October 20th, 2021, two young couples were hanging out inside of a little home in the woods in Henderson County, North Carolina. The couples were Rachel and her fiancé Chris, and their friends Autumn and Jake, whose home it was. Rachel and Autumn were in the kitchen preparing to dye Rachel's hair over the sink. Jake and Chris were in the living room discussing the very strange sightings of a black panther that had been reported all over town in recent days. So, North Carolina does have big cats, including panthers. After all, their professional football team is named the Carolina Panthers. However, the panthers in North Carolina are typically of the brownish color, not the pitch black variety like the panther that was apparently prowling all over Henderson County in recent days. Nonetheless, Chris was absolutely convinced that he had seen this black panther about a week ago when he was out walking his and Rachel's new puppy. He swore the panther had been following him in the tree line around his property, and he had been afraid it was thinking about attacking his dog. Ever since, he told Jake he'd been nervous walking around his property outside, and so he'd begun to carry a gun for protection. Jake was in the middle of telling Chris that he too was now carrying a gun around for the same reason, when they were interrupted by Rachel calling for Chris from the kitchen. Jake and Chris got up off the couch and walked into the kitchen, where Rachel told them that she'd been trying to show Autumn a YouTube video about how to dye hair at home when her phone had died. And so she asked Chris if he wouldn't mind going back to their apartment and getting her a phone charger. Now, obviously, Chris was not thrilled about going into the woods at night, with this panther roaming around, but he loved his fiancée and would do anything for her, and he had his gun, so he said he would go. And as Chris headed to the door to leave, Jake said, "Hold on a minute." He grabbed his flashlight and grabbed his gun and told Chris he would tag along and watch his buddies back. The two guys said they'd be back in a minute, and then they walked out the door. A light wind rustled the leaves of the trees as Jake and Chris set out on the little path that connected their two homes. They both stayed absolutely quiet as they walked, because they wanted to make sure they could hear any indication of this panther being nearby. But all they could hear was the wind, some crickets, and an owl hooting in the distance. But about halfway down the path, Chris suddenly heard something coming from the woods and instinctively shot out his hand to stop Jake in his tracks. They both froze, and then Jake raised his flashlight and shined it at the underbrush where Chris was saying he had heard noise. And for a second, all they saw were green leaves. But then, two eyes opened up and reflected back at them. The two men gasped and instinctively reached for their guns, but before they had to draw and do anything, this creature emerged from the underbrush, and it was just a raccoon. Chris and Jake laughed in relief and then continued walking down the path to Chris's house. They went inside, got Rachel's charger, and then they left and stepped back into the woods. But now, as Chris and Jake walked along this dark path, something just felt different. The crickets seemed to have gotten quieter and the wind had picked up. The owl that had been hooting before must have flown away because it was now strangely quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps and the wind in the trees. They were about 40 feet away from Jake's house when they suddenly heard a twig snap to their left. And so the two men turned to face the noise, and as they did, they heard another sound, a low, raspy growl. And so Jake aimed his flashlight at the bush where these noises had come from, and this time it was obvious it was not a raccoon, because the bushes were literally shaking like some enormous animal was inside of them. And so the two men looked at each other with wide eyes, and without saying a word, they both knew they were thinking the same thing. It's the panther. And so the two men drew their guns and they aimed it at the bush, hoping that this thing would just take off back into the woods. But it didn't. The bush continued to shake like whatever it was going to leap out. And so the men just opened fire, and they kept on shooting until they heard a new horrible sound. And the second they heard it, they dropped their guns. It would turn out that was not a panther. After Chris and Jake had left the house, Rachel and Autumn decided to pull a prank. They had found some expired eggs in the fridge, and they had decided they would go hide in the bushes near that pathway and pelt the guys with them. When Rachel saw Chris and Jake approaching, she tried to crouch down lower in the bush so as not to be seen, but as she did, she stepped on a twig. And at the same time, in anticipation of their prank, the women started to laugh. They tried to stifle their laughter, but that only made them snort and shake the bushes. And that combination of noises, the snapped twig, the stifled laughter, which sort of resembled a short raspy growl, and the shaking bushes, signaled to the guys that this was no prank. This was the panther, and if they didn't act, it might attack them. And so they drew their guns and they began to shoot until they heard Autumn scream out in horror. Tragically, by the time they had stopped shooting, it was already too late for Rachel. She had been shot to death. Law enforcement did an investigation into the shooting, and they declared it was just a horrible accident. Everybody was sober, and the two men were carrying their weapons legally, and so no one was ever charged with Rachel's death. And to this day, no one has ever gotten solid evidence that that Black Panther even exists. On a snowy morning in 1972, 22-year-old Sotria Kritsonis sat at her bus stop in Seattle, Washington, adjusting her knit cap against the cold. The hat actually still felt pretty weird on her head because just a few days earlier, she had cut her brown hair super short, and so she wasn't quite used to it yet. But despite that, she loved her new hair. In fact, she'd deliberately worn this big hat to hide her haircut, because this would make the reveal to her friends at school that much better. She glanced up Rainer Avenue for any sign of her bus, but there wasn't one. The city's public transportation system was all out of whack that day because of the weather, and so Tria was becoming pretty impatient because now her bus was over an hour late. She'd already missed her first class of the day because of this bus, and now she was in danger of missing her second class. And that's when she heard the beep of a car horn, and a pale yellow Volkswagen Beetle rolled up to the curb right in front of her. So Tria had to squint through the snow, but she could see the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat of this car, and he was rolling down the window of the passenger side and kind of waving her over. Curious, she walked up to the now open window and leaned in, and the warmth coming from inside the car felt great. And this is where Sotria got her first real look at the driver. He was a good-looking guy in his 20s, he was well-dressed, pleasant-seeming, just an overall normal-looking person. He explained that he'd actually been driving on Rainer Ave for a while, and he hadn't seen a bus in a long time, and so he offered to give Sotria a ride to her school. But remember, this is the 1970s, and hitchhiking at the time in America was pretty common, especially on the West Coast where Sotria was. And so pretty quickly, she agreed to get in, because she knew this likely was her best chance at making it to school for her second class, and she was freezing. After the man pulled back onto Rainer Avenue, Sotria sat back in the seat, enjoying the warm air blasting out of the vents. And as she did, she looked out her window at the familiar route passing by. Sotria was about to apologize to this guy for making him drive so far out of his way when she heard him turn on his blinker. He was preparing to turn right. And this struck Sotria as odd because, as she had explained to him back on the curb, her school was a straight shot down Rainer Ave. There was no need to turn. So what was he doing? Sotria looked over at the man, expecting him to explain why they were taking this sudden detour. But the man just stared straight ahead. And then a moment later, she heard the blinker turned on again, and she looked up and saw they were about to merge onto Interstate 5 southbound, which was definitely not the way to Sotria's school. And now, Sotria felt a pang of fear. She opened her mouth to tell this guy he was going the wrong way, but he cut her off, and he looked at her and he said, "You know, it's a terrible idea to take a ride from a stranger." The man kept on talking as he merged onto the highway, but Sotria was not listening at all. Instead, she was fixated on what he was doing with his right hand. His left hand was on the wheel, but with his right hand, he was fishing for something underneath his seat. And so Sotria's mind began to race. Without taking her eyes off of this man and what he was doing, she traced with her hand and felt for the door handle, but she couldn't feel it. And then she turned and realized there was no door handle. It had been removed. Just then, the man stopped rummaging around underneath his seat. Whatever he was looking for, he had found it. The man sat partway up and looked at Sotria, with his hand still hidden behind one of his legs, and a determined but emotionless expression on his face. At this point, Sotria felt her heart hammering so hard in her chest that she was worried she might pass out from terror. All she could think about was, what is he hiding behind his leg? What was underneath his seat? But then, something strange happened. The man's face changed from determined and almost cruel to confused. Sotria watched as his eyes darted up to the top of her head. The man told Sotria to take off her hat, and with trembling hands, she did as she was instructed, although she had no idea why he was asking. And when the hat was off her head, the man looked shocked, and he dropped whatever it was he had found back under his seat, and Sotria heard it land with a heavy metallic thud, but she couldn't see it. There was a long, tense silence, and then, when the man finally spoke, he just said, "Why did you cut your hair?" The man immediately got off the highway and drove fast to Sotria's school. When they got there, he opened up the door for her and told Sotria to get out and said she was lucky. Then he drove away. Sotria didn't report this encounter to police. She was kind of embarrassed that she had gotten into a stranger's car in the first place, and after all, the guy, despite being really creepy, hadn't hurt her at all, and so she basically just tried to forget about it. But a few years later, in 1975, Sotria was watching TV when she saw a familiar face come onto the screen. It was the man who had given her a ride, being led into a courtroom in handcuffs. Sotria dropped everything and turned up the volume, and what she heard made her numb with horror. Because the newscaster was saying that this man who had given her a ride was a suspected serial killer accused of murdering dozens of young women who he would lure into his pale yellow Volkswagen Beetle and then bludgeon them to death with a crowbar or tire iron. And he had a very specific type when it came to identifying his victims. They were young women who all had long brown hair. And this man's name was Ted Bundy. On June 29, 2013, 35-year-old Larry Wells woke up at 3 a.m., slipping out of his bed quietly so he wouldn't wake up his wife. Larry's wife was 3 months pregnant, and raising their 4-year-old daughter was already a full-time job for her, so Larry wanted to be sure that she got all the sleep she needed. After climbing out of bed, Larry slipped into his work clothes that he had laid out the night before, and then he tiptoed through the house out to his car. Larry drove for about 5 minutes through the desolate streets of Hamburg, which is a quiet suburb just outside of Buffalo, New York. And at this hour, pretty much every business in town was closed, so it was very quiet and peaceful. Larry eventually turned into a large parking lot and pulled into a parking space. He got out of his car and began walking toward the big, sprawling building at the center of the lot. And as he walked towards it, he glanced up at the sign above the entrance of the building, and as he looked, he smiled. This sign represented something that had deep roots in Larry's childhood and also now an important place in Larry's adult life. That sign's multicolored letters spelled out Toys R Us. Toys R Us was a very popular toy store chain in the United States at the time, and it's where Larry had worked for the last 7 years. Larry loved kids, and for a while he had wanted to become a teacher. He had actually studied education and even got a master's degree, but after graduate school, he couldn't find a full-time teaching job, so he wound up working as a substitute teacher. But at the time, Larry and his wife wanted to start a family and move into a new house, so that's when Larry decided to get a job working at Toys R Us to supplement his income. At first, Larry thought of his job at Toys R Us as just being a sort of placeholder job, something to have until he got hired on as a full-time teacher somewhere. But it turned out Larry sort of loved working there. He got to regularly interact with children, which he loved doing, and also his fun-loving personality and solid work ethic just made him a perfect fit for the company. And so pretty quickly, Larry took a lot of pride in his job at Toys R Us, and all of his coworkers there adored him, and by the time he and his wife had their first child in 2009, Larry had been promoted to store manager. This was his career. And because Larry cared so much about this job and about Toys R Us, he would often start work at 4 a.m. on Saturday mornings just to help the stockers unload the merchandise trucks, even though he didn't have to do that. And that's exactly what he was doing on this particular Saturday morning, showing up early to lend a helping hand. And so Larry walked up to the front door of the Toys R Us building, and waiting outside were 2 of his employees, Cindy Barone and Isaac Millette Lloyd. The building was locked, so Larry pulled out his keys, unlocked the door, slid it open, and let the 2 workers inside. Larry walked in after them and then slid the door shut and locked it back up, because the store wasn't actually scheduled to open for another several hours. Cindy and Isaac made their way over to the time clock and punched in, then they picked up their walkie-talkies, which they clipped to their belts, and they began their shifts. As for Larry, he headed straight to the storeroom, opened up the back door for the merchandise truck driver, and then began helping the driver unload the truck. And then at some point, Cindy and Isaac came over, and they grabbed pallets of this merchandise from the back, and then wheeled those pallets into the store on dollies. Isaac took his pallet to his section of the store, while Cindy took her merchandise pallet to the next section over. And then both of them got to work restocking the shelves, which had been thinned out by the Friday night rush. By 4:30 a.m., the truck was fully unloaded, so Larry let the driver back out of the building and then locked the back door after him. At this point, Larry, Cindy, and Isaac were now working in separate parts of the building, and they couldn't see each other, but they could communicate using their walkie-talkie radios. And you need to keep in mind that this particular Toys R Us store was massive, over 41,000 square feet. And so really it was normal if you were working in off-hour shifts to basically not see anybody else physically and just basically talk to them on your walkie-talkie. A little before 5 a.m., so about 30 minutes later, an employee named Anthony Armstrong stood outside the front entrance, pulled out his cell phone, and called his manager, Larry, and told him he was outside the store, ready to start his shift, and could he come over and unlock the door. And so Larry made his way to the front door, he opened it up, let Anthony inside, and then slid the door shut and locked it back up. About 10 minutes after that, another employee named Richard Shepard approached the front door of the Toys R Us and also called Larry so he could be let in the building. But this time, Larry's phone just rang several times and went to voicemail. So Richard sent Larry a text message and then waited a minute for a reply, hoping he would reply soon, but he didn't. And so as Richard is just sort of standing there, he pressed his face against the glass and peered into the store to look for any movement, thinking maybe he could, bang on the door and get one of the other employees' attention so they could let him in. But he didn't see anybody. So, feeling sort of frustrated, Richard stepped away from the door and walked east towards the Babies R Us side of the building, which had a separate entrance from the main store, and when he got there, he found one of the sliding doors at Babies R Us was wide open. Now, this really surprised Richard because the company had very strict loss prevention policies that required all doors to remain locked during non-business hours. But this was actually kind of lucky for him because now he was able to just stroll right into the store without needing anyone to help him inside. And so once he was in, Richard clocked in and began his shift stocking shelves in his section. Now, at this point, Richard still hadn't seen anybody else, and he did think it was kind of eerie to be all alone in this vast fluorescent-lit store before the sun had even come up. A few sections over from Richard, Isaac was still stocking his shelves, and he was taking his time as usual because Isaac was meticulous and took great pride in his work. He also really liked Larry as a manager, and so he always tried to do a really good job when Larry was around because he wanted to impress Larry. Cindy, on the other hand, was actually almost done stocking her section. But it wasn't because she was lazy, it was because she had worked at Toys R Us longer than a lot of the other employees, and so she knew the merchandise inside and out, and she could basically make her way through the entire giant store with her eyes closed, and so she was just really quick. As the hour wore on, all the employees kept plugging away, sort of independent of each other, and outside, as the sky turned from pitch black to a pale blue as the sun rose, the lights in the parking lot switched off for the day. Isaac looked outside and noticed the sun coming up, and he knew the store was going to be opening in just a couple of hours, and he still had more merchandise that he would need to put out onto the shelves. So he wheeled his now empty pallet to the back of the store into the stock room, and he was about to load up another full pallet of merchandise when he suddenly heard a noise coming from inside the store. It was a repetitive noise, like a wailing sound, but sort of flat and robotic. At first, just because Isaac didn't know what the sound was, he simply tried to ignore it and just focus on his work. But the sound just kept going on, and nobody seemed to be turning it off, and that's when Isaac realized this was actually an alarm going off inside the store. And so Isaac stopped what he was doing, and he pulled out his radio, and he pressed the button and said, "Hey Larry, there's an alarm going off in the store, can you please turn it off?" But a minute went by, and the alarm still kept going, and there were no responses from Larry on the radio. And so Isaac turned the channel on his radio and radioed everyone in the store and asked for someone to please go find Larry and please get him to turn off that alarm. Cindy happened to be closest to the manager's office at the front of the store when Isaac made this radio call, and so Cindy replied into the radio that she would go see if Larry was in his office. Shortly after that, Isaac emerged from the stockroom, pulling behind him a pallet of merchandise, and as he did, suddenly a woman's scream echoed through the entire store, and then Isaac heard this woman sobbing and shouting, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" Isaac had never heard Cindy scream or cry before, so at first, he wasn't even sure if it was her. He just felt completely disoriented. And then Isaac saw his coworker Anthony rushing towards the manager's office, and so Isaac followed behind. Outside the office, both men saw Cindy crying and shaking, and in between sobs, she said she needed to call 911, and then she rushed past them, picked up a phone from one of the checkout lanes, and dialed. At this point, Richard, the employee who had shown up last, rushed up the aisle to where Isaac and Anthony were now standing, and the three men just sort of looked at each other, confused and frightened, and then, without a better plan, they just walked into the manager's office, and immediately it became clear why Cindy was so upset. Their manager, Larry, was slumped over in his chair, bleeding profusely from a hole in his chest. Isaac reflexively called out to Larry, but Larry didn't respond. The only sound in the office was a loud pulsing screech from the phone receiver, which had been left off the hook. And so the three men just turned and ran out of the office over to Cindy, who by this point was on the phone with 911, totally hysterical, screaming into the phone that their manager had been shot and she wasn't sure if he was alive or dead. The Hamburg Police Department received word from dispatch of a shooting with a possible active shooter scenario at the Toys R Us, and so every police unit in town busted a U-turn and sped in their cruisers straight for the store. Now, the 911 operator had told Cindy that the police were going to be there soon, and so everybody in the store needed to exit immediately and wait in the parking lot. So minutes later, the police arrived at the store, they saw the four employees outside waiting for them, and so after moving the employees across the street to a safe location, the police went inside the store ready to potentially engage with an active shooter, because nobody knew for sure what the situation really was. Was there still an armed shooter inside somewhere? Or maybe had they left the store and they were on the loose in the area? Nobody knew. Detective Sergeant Scott Cascino was still at home and barely awake when he got the call about the shooting. and he found himself feeling totally confused and wondering if he had even heard correctly. Like, the idea that there was a shooting inside of a Toys R Us at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning in Hamburg, of all places, just seemed impossible. Kashino was a veteran detective who knew that the town of Hamburg had very little violent crime. So as he quickly got dressed and hopped into his police-issued vehicle and drove to the Toys R Us, he really didn't know what to expect. When Kashino arrived at Toys R Us and parked his car in the lot, he watched as the other police officers who had already arrived began carefully advancing towards the building with their guns drawn. Those officers would slowly make their way through the store looking for anybody, but finding no one, before finally getting to the manager's office, where they went inside and they saw what Cindy had seen. Larry, all alone inside, slumped over in his chair. The police called out Larry's name several times, but he was unresponsive. One of the officers walked over to him and pressed his fingers into Larry's wrist, and he turned to his colleagues and signaled that Larry did still have a pulse. But the officers saw all the blood on the floor and they could barely hear Larry's breathing, and so they agreed they basically had no time to waste here in getting this man medical attention. And so the officers just grabbed Larry by the shoulders and dragged him out of his office, through the store, and out the front door, right to a waiting ambulance. 2 EMTs lifted Larry onto a gurney, they strapped him down, and then placed him into the back of the ambulance, and then the EMTs hopped in with him, closed the doors, and the ambulance sped off towards the hospital. And as that ambulance sped across town, the EMTs in the back worked on Larry, trying to compress the wound in his chest and get the bleeding to stop. The EMTs noticed that in addition to the huge hole in Larry's chest, there was another wound in his shoulder, but comparatively speaking, it was not nearly as big of a deal as the chest wound. And then as the EMTs continued doing their work, they realized, these wounds were not gunshot wounds, they were knife wounds. Larry had been stabbed. However, despite all the efforts made by these EMTs to try to save Larry, he would unfortunately pass away from his wounds when they were only about halfway to the hospital. Back at the Toys R Us, police had set up a perimeter around the property, and then the SWAT team arrived. The SWAT team then searched both inside and outside the building, and then reported to Detective Kashino that they didn't find anything or anyone that was suspicious, and so at this point, all investigators were clear to now enter the building. It was also around this time that Detective Kashino and the rest of the first responders learned that the victim had died on the way to the hospital, and that contrary to what the initial theory had been, that he had not been shot, he had been stabbed to death. Kashino and crime scene investigators proceeded into the Toys R Us and headed directly into the manager's office, where Larry had been found. Once inside, everything was carefully swabbed for DNA and dusted for fingerprints, and as they did this, investigators were careful not to step in the long streak of Larry's blood that had been left there on the ground when the police had dragged him out. There was also a security DVR on the table. It was where footage from all the store's security cameras was fed and recorded onto a hard drive. And very clearly, the power cord to that security DVR had been unplugged and pulled away from the wall. Kashino had a hunch that one of the employees who had been working that morning was Larry's killer, and the footage from the surveillance cameras around the property may very well reveal which one it was. So getting this DVR connected and reviewing the footage on it from the surveillance cameras would be crucial. At this point, the 4 employees who had been there that morning, Cindy, Isaac, Anthony, and Richard, were the primary suspects in this murder, and so Kashino and his team quickly separated them so they could all be interviewed individually. Investigators put Isaac in the passenger seat of one of the police cruisers, and Kashino sat in the car with him. And the first thing Kashino noticed was how Isaac was trembling and tripping over his words. And so Isaac's nervousness and his inability to answer questions clearly made him seem suspicious, and so did the behavior of Anthony Armstrong, who was the youngest member of the employee crew. He completely clammed up during his interview and refused to answer questions, so that raised a red flag too. Then, detectives questioned Cindy, who was the one who actually found Larry's body, and she was cooperative and helped investigators develop a timeline for the events of the morning, but critically, during her interview, she made it very clear that Anthony was the last person to see Larry alive. Then, investigators learned that the final employee, Richard Shepard, was late for work that morning. And when detectives asked him why, Richard explained that he had stopped at the 24-hour grocery store to buy a drink and some snacks to help him get through his shift. Richard then recounted that when he had gotten to work that morning, he had tried calling Larry to open the door for him, but there was no response, and so he wound up entering through another door, the Babies R Us door, that just happened to be wide open. And then Richard explained that, that in and of itself was very unusual because they were all under strict orders to keep the doors locked at all times during non-business hours. And so the investigators finished up their initial interviews with the 4 Toys R Us employees who were there that morning, but they told them they would still need to stick around a bit longer. At about noon, the Toys R Us regional manager of loss prevention for the area, Bernie Grusha, came out to the store. Toys R Us corporate had contacted him and sent him out here to try to be as helpful as possible with the investigation. Kashino saw Grusha arrive, walked over and introduced himself, and then a few minutes later asked Grusha to come into the manager's office to try to help the investigators view the store's security footage. Once inside the office, Grusha just plugged the DVR back into the wall and then got the system up and running. Kashino looked at his notes and saw that Cindy said she had arrived at the store shortly before 4 a.m. So Kashino asked Grusha to please wind the security footage back to about 3:45 a.m. And so Grusha pulled up the security video at 3:45 a.m., and then very slowly, the detectives began examining footage from each of the store's more than a dozen security cameras from 3:45 onward. And as they did this, Kashino, who was right nearby, pulled out his notebook and began writing down the exact time at which he saw the employees show up at work on this video, and then he compared the security footage timestamp to the timelines that each of the employees had given him. And also, Kashino took note of where in the store specifically each employee was working during the first 2 hours of their shifts. On the video, Kashino saw Larry, Isaac, and Cindy all entering the store at 3:55 a.m. And then a few minutes later, Larry could be seen in the back of the store, letting that truck driver inside the building so they could offload merchandise. And then, at exactly 4:24 a.m., Kashino noticed some movement from the camera inside of the Babies R Us department that was pointed toward the front door of the building. And so Kashino asked Grusha to please bring that specific video into full frame. And once that video was maximized, the investigators saw a dark figure standing right outside the front door to Babies R Us for about 30 seconds. This figure appeared to struggle with the lock before the door suddenly opened and they walked inside and disappeared somewhere inside the store. Kashino turned to Grusha and said it sort of looked like the person in the video had jimmied or pried the door open, and Grusha agreed. Kashino directed Grusha to pull up the global view, which would allow them to see all of the cameras at once. This would let them track this mysterious figure's movements through the store. The investigators watched on the global view as this figure disappeared from one camera's view and then popped up in another, but as they watched, it became pretty clear that this person was doing their best to avoid being in front of the cameras. They were snaking and dodging their way through the store, hiding behind shelves wherever they could. They were acting really sketchy. But more than that, what seemed really apparent to Kashino and Grusha and the other investigators was that this person on the video camera clearly seemed to know the layout of the store and exactly where the hidden cameras inside the building were positioned. At one point, when the intruder walked across one of the camera's field of vision and was relatively easy to see, Kashino asked Grusha to pause the camera and zoom in on this person to get a better look. And as soon as Grusha did this, it was clear to investigators that this person was trying very hard to disguise their identity. The figure had this dark thing wrapped around their face like a scarf. They had all dark clothing on, including dark sweatpants with lettering down the left pant leg, and they were wearing a two-toned baseball cap. But by far the most chilling thing about this figure was what they appeared to be holding in their right hand. It looked very much like they were carrying a large knife. But despite all this, the security video was grainy and low resolution, especially zoomed in, so nobody in the room could make out any of the figure's facial features. The investigators couldn't even make out if this was a man or a woman, and it was also impossible to tell what the lettering on the side of their sweatpants said. And so eventually, Grusha zoomed back out and resumed playing the footage, and everyone in the room watched as this mysterious figure made their way to the front of the store. They moved along the front wall, and then at exactly 4:32 a.m., the figure entered the manager's office. And shortly after that, the security video cut out. And so the running assumption amongst the investigators was that, this intruder must have pulled the plug on the DVR, and that's why it cut. Kashino asked Grusha to rewind the surveillance footage and play it back from the point that figure entered the store. They cycled through the video again, and then once more, slowing it down and zooming in on the intruder again. And eventually, it dawned on one of the investigators that the two-tone baseball cap the figure was seen wearing in the footage looked an awful lot like the Florida Gators hat that had been left behind on the floor inside of the office. And so this confirmed for detectives that that hat they had found had very likely been worn by the killer, and it was, along with this surveillance footage, possibly the most valuable piece of evidence that they had. Once they were finished viewing the surveillance footage, Kashino unplugged the power cord and then carefully bagged it into evidence, because he now knew that the killer had very likely yanked it from the wall. Then Kashino handed off the power cord along with that hat they had found to crime scene technicians who prepared these items to be transported back to the crime lab to be swabbed for DNA. 2 days after Larry's murder, the whole community of Hamburg was still frightened because the killer had not been caught. But by this time, the yellow police tape had been pulled from the perimeter of the Toys R Us, and the store was now open for business and crowded with customers. Police also released the surveillance video and images of the baseball cap to the news media on the off chance that somebody in the area might recognize the killer's walk or maybe the clothing they were wearing. Meanwhile, back at the crime lab, technicians had swabbed the DVR power cord and the Florida Gators baseball cap, and they were able to develop what they believed was the killer's DNA profile. They uploaded that DNA profile into CODIS, which is the federal DNA database with loads and loads of DNA profiles. However, after it was uploaded, there was no match. So at this point, the investigators, which now included the FBI, made it their main objective to collect DNA samples from every employee of the Hamburg Toys R Us store, both current employees and former employees, because many, if not all of these people, would not be in the CODIS database. And remember, the leading theory at this point is that, Larry was killed by potentially an active employee or a former employee, somebody with access to this building and an understanding of where the cameras were. And so over the course of the next few weeks, investigators developed a list of Toys R Us past and present employees and also other people connected to Larry and began making contact with them. Police interviewed literally hundreds of people, and not one person they talked to could think of anyone who would have done this. Seemingly nobody had any issues with Larry Wells. And on top of that, it was like nobody had one unkind thing to say about him. He seemed universally loved. But there was one piece of information that surfaced from a witness who had been near the Toys R Us in the early hours of the morning that Larry was killed. And that person recalled seeing a black Chevy Impala sedan parked inside the toy store's parking lot at that time. Now, this Toys R Us, despite having loads of cameras, did not have any dedicated exterior cameras, so there were no images of this vehicle, and this witness did not get a license plate number for the car. Police also could not immediately trace a black Chevy Impala to any of the Toys R Us employees. And so, while some members of the investigative team searched for this car without much to go on, others continued to track down and collect DNA swabs from current and former employees of the Hamburg Toys R Us, and they ended up with a total of 47 DNA samples. It would take several weeks for each DNA profile to be processed by the crime lab, but finally, in mid-August, a month and a half after Larry's murder, the results from all 47 DNA tests came in. And none were a match, meaning not one of those current or former employees had a DNA profile that matched the DNA profile from the hat and the power cord found inside of the crime scene. Detective Kashino and his team were frankly shocked. They expected there to be a match here, but now they just felt lost. It was like months of work had gotten them nowhere. And so once again, they turned to the FBI for help. And they asked the Bureau to draw up a psychological and personality profile of the killer. And so the FBI created that profile and then began reviewing recent arrests in the upstate New York area, and they would find one person who matched their profile almost exactly. The man's name was Patrick Walden, and he had recently been arrested in a neighboring town, and he had just been released from jail. And Kashino soon learned that the vehicle Patrick was driving when he was arrested was registered to his girlfriend's mother, who happened to be an employee at the Hamburg Toys R Us where Larry Wells was killed. And perhaps even more importantly, Kashino discovered that when police searched that vehicle at the time of Patrick's arrest, inside of the car, they found a very long knife. Detective Cascino and the rest of the investigation now considered Patrick to be their primary suspect. He had a connection to the Toys R Us through his girlfriend's mother, he'd been in possession of a weapon that was at least similar to the one used to kill Larry, and he fit the FBI's profile of the killer. So Cascino quickly secured a warrant to put around-the-clock surveillance on Patrick. And on an afternoon, not long after that, an undercover cop tailed Patrick as he drove through town. The undercover cop made sure to stay far enough back not to draw any attention, and he followed Patrick for several minutes, almost at a leisurely pace. Then, the cop noticed Patrick's driver's side window roll down, and so sensing an opportunity here, the cop sped up a bit and leaned forward in his car to get a better look inside of Patrick's car, and he saw Patrick throw something out of the open window onto the street. Now, the cop had no idea what it was, but there was no way he was going to miss this opportunity. And so instead of continuing to trail Patrick, the cop pulled over to the side of the road, he got out, he walked into the middle of the road, being careful of oncoming traffic, and he began looking at the ground for whatever it was Patrick threw, and he couldn't believe his luck, because right there in the middle of the road was a still smoldering cigarette butt, something Patrick had just been smoking. And so it would definitely have a sample of Patrick's DNA on it. And so the undercover cop slipped on a pair of gloves, he crouched down, picked up the butt, carefully extinguished it, dropped it into an evidence bag, and headed back to his vehicle. The cigarette butt was sent to the crime lab for processing, and Detective Cascino and his team thought that was going to be a huge break in the case. But as with all the other DNA samples police had collected to that point, Cascino knew it would still take weeks before test results came back. And during that time, the local news started running stories about how the investigation still hadn't caught the killer, and about how people in the community were tense, feeling as though anyone among them could be the killer. And on top of that, Larry's widow was now more than 5 months pregnant with the couple's second daughter, who would be born without a father. And Larry's widow and the rest of Larry's family feared that the investigation was really losing momentum. And so Cascino was feeling a ton of pressure to crack this case. So while he and his team waited for DNA results on the cigarette butt, they went back to the beginning, reviewing their case files and looking for anything they might have overlooked. And it was at that point that investigators realized there was still one Toys R Us employee on their list that they actually had not obtained a DNA sample from. In fact, every time they had contacted this particular employee to request a sample, this person had an excuse as to why it wasn't a good time. They were either out of town, attending a family event, or just feeling under the weather. And the more time that passed, the more it seemed like this employee was actually deliberately trying to avoid giving their DNA sample. So detectives reached out to this person again and said, hey, we got to do this sample. But once again, the employee said, no, it was not a good time. They said they were still very distraught over everything that had happened. And so for the time being, they had gone to stay at their father's house, so they were not around to give the sample. Cascino and his team believed that they had already been patient enough with this employee and that the employee's evasiveness was really starting to look quite suspicious. So the investigators located this employee's father's house, and they drove out there hoping to basically force this employee to give a DNA sample. And so the investigators made their way out to this house, they parked outside, got out of their vehicles, and began walking up towards the door. And as they passed by a car that was parked in the driveway, one of the investigators stopped in his tracks. He called out to the others and waved them over to the car he was next to, and then he pointed to something on the rear bumper. It was a Florida Gators bumper sticker. And remember, there was a Florida Gators hat found in the crime scene. That's where the DNA sample was being pulled from. When Cascino saw this, he felt a jolt of excitement. He felt like this could be a big break. And so he and the others walked up to the front door and they knocked, and the employee they were trying to get this DNA sample from answered, appearing very surprised to see the investigators at their father's house. But Cascino was very disarming, and he apologized for bothering them. And he said, look, I know this is not a good time, but the police department really needs to get their DNA right now, just so they can eliminate them from the suspect pool. The employee nodded and said they understood, and then Cascino handed them a swab and asked them to please put it in their mouth and swab their cheek. The employee did that and handed the swab right back, and Cascino dropped it into a plastic vial and sealed it inside. The investigators thanked the employee, then they returned to their vehicles and drove back to the station. Once there, they handed over the swab to the crime lab, but they knew, just like with the Patrick Walden swab and all the others, they would have to wait weeks before this result would come back. While they waited, no major new leads developed, The only thing that came up was investigators learned that Isaac, the employee whose anxiousness had raised suspicions right after the murder, quit his job at Toys R Us, but that didn't really lead the police anywhere. Then finally, in the middle of October, DNA test results came back for Patrick Walden, who had thrown that cigarette butt out the window that the undercover had found, and also for the final Toys R Us employee that police had to go to his father's house to collect that swab for. And one of those two DNA profiles would be a match for the DNA that was found on the Florida Gators hat and the security DVR power cord. And so, more than 3 months after Larry Wells was murdered, Detective Cascino and his team now knew what happened inside the Toys R Us on that Saturday morning in June, and they knew the identity of that figure in the grainy surveillance footage. Based on interviews, DNA samples, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened at the Toys R Us on June 29, 2013. In the dark, early morning hours, the killer drove a black Chevy Impala into the Toys R Us parking lot. They parked the vehicle and then just sat there, scoping out the closed store and planning their entry. After a few minutes, the killer pulled a scarf around their face to conceal their identity. They grabbed their knife off the passenger seat and then got out of their car and walked up to the Babies R Us entrance on the side of the store. The killer walked up to the entrance and then kind of jostled at the door for about 30 seconds until they got it open, and then they went inside. Once inside, they very carefully walked along the walls, ducking behind shelves and doing their best to hide from the store surveillance cameras. The killer eventually reached the manager's office, and they walked inside and closed the door behind them. The killer then walked over to the DVR surveillance system and pulled the power cord out of the wall, disabling all the cameras in the store. 15 minutes later, store manager Larry Wells entered that very same office and right away saw the killer crouched over, attempting to open up the store safe. The killer heard Larry enter and they wheeled around and immediately held up their knife and demanded Larry come over here and open the safe. But Larry, instead of doing that, just reached for the phone to call for help. But at the same time, the killer lunged at Larry and the two men began to struggle. Larry tried desperately to push the killer off of him, but the killer began swinging their arms wildly, at one point stabbing Larry in the shoulder. And when that happened, Larry stumbled forward, and the killer at that point just raised the knife again and brought it down into Larry, stabbing him in the left side of his chest. Larry screamed out in pain and then collapsed into the chair. The killer just stood there for a second, shocked at the sight of Larry now bleeding profusely from the stab wound they had just inflicted on him. And so the killer, who was starting to panic, just forgot about the safe and just turned and ran out of the office, not realizing their baseball cap had fallen off during the attack. Once out of the office, the killer slipped through the store unseen and rushed back outside. They got back into their Impala, sped out of the parking lot, and tossed the knife into a dumpster as they fled the scene. Back in the manager's office, Larry Wells was slipping in and out of consciousness. But in one of his conscious moments, he did manage to trip the store alarm. However, despite that alarm going off, Larry would lay there bleeding for nearly an hour before he was finally discovered and help was called. But unfortunately, by that point, it was already too late. For months, detectives had dealt with one DNA test after another that did not match the hat or the DVR cord. But they did finally get a match from that last employee they had tested, and that employee was Bernie Grusha, the regional vice president of loss prevention for Toys R Us, and the same man who had assisted investigators with the security footage. He literally watched himself maneuver through the store, eventually committing a murder while he sat there with police. On October 16, 2013, police arrested Grusha and charged him with the murder of his friend and employee, Larry Wells. Investigators served a search warrant on Grusha's home, and what they found in the garage of the house brought them much closer to understanding his motives. Police found over $200,000 in stolen Toys R Us merchandise. And what the investigation would soon uncover is that Bernie Grusha, who had been hired to protect Toys R Us assets, was actually robbing Toys R Us blind. He had stolen merchandise from numerous Toys R Us stores in New York and Pennsylvania, and he was then reselling this merchandise on eBay to help chip away at his mountain of debt while continuing to live a lifestyle that was way beyond his means. Investigators learned that his wife became fed up with Grusha's reckless spending, and she also discovered that he was cheating on her, and so their marriage was falling apart. And just 3 weeks before Larry Wells' murder, Grusha had this argument with his wife, after which he had left the room, ran upstairs, entered the master bedroom, got out his 9mm Beretta pistol, and fired it. And his wife ran upstairs and found her husband lying face down on the floor, thinking he must have killed himself, and so she frantically ran to him and turned him over, at which point he looked back at her, completely unharmed, and told her he just wanted to test her and see how she'd react. His wife reacted by calling the police, who quickly showed up, confiscated the gun, and placed Grusha under arrest on charges of criminal possession of a weapon and harassment. His wife then filed a protection order, and so Grusha could not return to the house that he shared with his family. So he went to live with his father as his life continued to fall apart. Grusha had reached a point of total desperation by the time he parked the black Chevy Impala in the Toys R Us parking lot that morning in late June, before taking the life of a man he had hired and considered his friend. It turned out Grusha had rented that black Chevy Impala, and when he arrived back at the store later to assist investigators, he was driving his own car. But police were able to trace that rental car back to him, which further solidified their case. Investigators also discovered that Grusha had actually used his key to unlock the Babies R Us door. He had simply pretended to be prying it open for the security cameras, because he figured that would point investigators to a lower-ranking employee or someone who did not work at the store at all. Grusha eventually admitted to everything he had done in exchange for a reduced sentence. He claimed he did not intend to kill Larry Wells that morning, that he had gone in there to commit a robbery, and then things had simply got out of control, and he had stabbed Larry while flailing about with his knife in his hand. Prosecutors knew there was no way they could prove intent, so they ended up reducing the murder charge to just first-degree manslaughter. And so Bernie Grusha pled guilty and was sentenced to a minimum term of 25 years in prison. On a humid summer morning in June 1999, 36-year-old Sanju Bhagat was hard at work on a farm outside of Nagpur, a city in central India. The sun had just risen, and the air was already so hot that he found it hard to breathe. Sanju and a group of farmhands were hard at work tending to the soybean crops. He made his way through the field, stopping to catch his breath every few steps. Sanju moved a lot slower than his coworkers because of his massive belly. For the past 15 years, Sanju had struggled beneath the weight of his ever-growing stomach. At first, when he was in his early 20s, his family had thought he was just filling out a little, like all young men do when they become adults. But Sanju's stomach didn't stop growing. It kept getting bigger and bigger until it had swelled to the size of a massive watermelon. But his arms and legs stayed stick-thin. He never understood why his belly kept growing since he didn't eat much. By the time Sanju reached his early 30s, he was in constant pain, and his family desperately wanted him to see a doctor. But he couldn't afford to take time off of work. Although, deep down, he had to admit he was a little scared of what the doctor might find. Sanju wiped the sweat from his eyes and told himself to keep moving. As he shoveled, he overheard another farmhand make a nasty joke about maternity clothes. A few men laughed. People liked to joke that he looked pregnant. Sanju had been relentlessly teased about his so-called pregnancy for years. His neighbors and his old childhood friends would point and laugh at him. He knew he should be used to it by now, but it still upset him. But his belly wasn't just a source of embarrassment for Sanju. The sheer weight of his stomach made even the simplest things, like getting up from a chair or bending over, very hard to do. Even now, as he pushed himself to keep up with the other men in the field, he could feel his back stiffening and his arms and shoulders aching. By midday, he felt ready to drop from physical exhaustion. The sun beat down on Sanju's head and he could feel his chest tighten. He tried to keep working, but today it was harder to breathe than usual. No matter how deeply he inhaled, he couldn't quite catch his breath. Finally, he dropped his shovel and doubled over, gasping for air. Sanju gathered what little strength he had left and stood up straight. He could feel other farm workers' eyes on him as he gathered his tools and headed home. It was the longest walk of Sanju's life. He felt humiliated and useless, but he was also afraid. He could barely take a breath. By the time he got to the small home he shared with his family, he nearly fell through the front door. The last thing he remembered was falling hard on the tile floor. Sanju's mother was fixing lunch in the kitchen when she heard a noise in the front of the house. She ran into the living room and found her son collapsed on the floor. She grabbed the phone and called an ambulance, then rushed to Sanju's side and knelt down beside him. She tried to roll him over on his back so he could breathe better, but it was very difficult because of his enormous stomach. She muttered every prayer she could think of, straining her ears for the sound of a siren. And finally, in the distance, she heard it. By the time the ambulance pulled up in front of their home, Sanju was barely breathing. The paramedics quickly assessed Sanju's condition. They put an oxygen mask on him, then strapped him to a gurney and loaded him up into an ambulance. Sanju's mother wanted to go with him, but the nearest major hospital was in Mumbai, an 11-hour drive from Nagpur. All she could do was watch as the ambulance sped away with her son. Early the next morning, Dr. Ajay Mehta had just started his shift in the oncology ward at Tata Memorial Hospital. He was alerted that a new patient named Sanju Bhagat had been brought in all the way from Nagpur and that he needed to be seen right away. Dr. Mehta hurried over to Sanju's room. If someone was rushed in an ambulance from so far away, it had to be a serious emergency. As soon as Dr. Mehta examined Sanju's giant swollen belly, he instructed the nurse to prepare the operating room for surgery. Dr. Mehta was a specialist in tumor removal, and he was certain that Sanju had a massive tumor in his stomach, possibly the biggest one he'd ever seen. The tumor was likely pressing against Sanju's diaphragm, which was why he couldn't breathe. And given how big it was, and Sanju's weakened condition, the tumor had to be removed immediately. While another nurse prepped Sanju for the operation, Dr. Mehta gathered his surgical team and headed to the operating room. As they sterilized their hands and put on clean scrubs, Dr. Mehta warned them that the tumor's sheer size would make this a very challenging operation. There was a risk of damaging the soft tissue in Sanju's stomach, his nerve endings, or blood vessels. In the worst case, the surgery could cause severe internal bleeding or even death. A few minutes later, Sanju was wheeled into the operating room on a gurney. Once he was under anesthesia, Dr. Mehta called for a scalpel. He placed one hand on Sanju's stomach for leverage, then he cut into Sanju's belly. After the blade broke through Sanju's skin and opened up his chest area, Dr. Mehta expected to see blood and a bright red mass of cancerous cells. Instead, gallons of thick, yellowish fluid gushed from Sanju's stomach, spilling onto the floor. The entire surgical team gasped. Dr. Mehta jumped out of the way, trying to avoid the surge of bile. It had a foul odor that made everyone in the room start to gag. Nurses ran toward him with towels, trying to sop up the putrid-smelling liquid. While they cleaned up the mess, Dr. Mehta remained calm and carefully inserted his hand into Sanju's stomach to locate the tumor. At first, all he felt was thick jelly-like fluid sliding between his fingers. Then he grazed something unusual. His eyes went wide as he dove a little deeper. His palm wrapped around something soft, but with a brittle core. He realized this was not a tumor. Whatever was in Sanju's stomach had bones, a lot of them. Dr. Mehta's jaw dropped as his hand explored the object floating in Sanju's stomach. He grabbed onto one of the tiny bones and began to slowly pull it up and out of Sanju's stomach. As he lifted the bizarre object into the air, he could hear more gasps from everyone in the room. Dr. Mehta could hardly believe his eyes. What he was looking at shouldn't be possible. He had never seen anything like this in his entire medical career. He placed it on a medical tray for analysis and turned back to Sanju. Thankfully, he had survived the operation. But Dr. Mehta couldn't help but speculate how something so strange could have gotten inside of Sanju. A few hours later, Sanju awoke in a hospital bed. His stomach was sore, but when he moved his hand to grasp his belly, he looked down in shock. The giant lump was gone. He ran his hand over his flat stomach. He hadn't seen it like this in almost 20 years. He took a deep breath and smiled as he felt his chest expand. He couldn't believe he could breathe again without any pain. Just then, Dr. Mehta appeared in the doorway to Sanju's room with a very serious look on his face. He confirmed that the surgery was a success, but as Dr. Mehta explained what they had found inside of his body, the smile slowly faded from Sanju's face. The object Dr. Mehta had removed from Sanju's stomach was a ball of pink flesh with a tuft of dark brown hair growing along one side. 2 fully formed feet protruded from either end. In the middle was the beginning of a jawline. But what Dr. Mehta couldn't forget was the fully formed human hand that was attached to this ball of flesh. It was what he had grasped in a gruesome handshake when he lowered his hand into Sanju's stomach. The hand had fingernails protruding from it. The nails were so overgrown they almost looked like tiny claws. A grayish-yellow tube grew out of the center of the fleshy mass, connecting it to Sanju's stomach. Dr. Mehta told Sanju that the surgical staff had witnessed one of the rarest medical conditions on Earth. In a way, Sanju had been pregnant, not for the 16 years that his belly was protruding, but since before he was even born. The hairy, mutated lump he had removed was Sanju's twin. Sanju was a victim of an incredibly rare condition called fetus in fetu, which means fetus in fetus. When Sanju and his twin were first conceived, they started out as identical twins, which is when a single fertilized egg splits into 2 embryos. But something went wrong during that division, and the cells that became Sanju's twin latched onto his embryo. As Sanju developed, his body formed around the twin cells, which in turn fed off his bloodstream. This twin did not have a functional brain or heart, so it wasn't alive in the traditional sense. But as Sanju grew, so did his twin. It fed on the contents of Sanju's stomach like a parasite, using the yellowish tube as an umbilical cord. If Dr. Mehta hadn't eventually removed it from Sanju's stomach, it would have gotten so big that it would have killed Sanju. Sanju recovered physically from the surgery in just a few weeks. But when he returned to Nagpur, he was upset to find that his neighbors still made fun of him. Word had spread in the news about what had been inside of his stomach. Instead of calling him pregnant, now he was the man who gave birth to his brother. After his surgery, Sanju refused to allow doctors to follow up with his case. He never wanted a reminder that he had carried a dead twin inside of his belly. The next and final story is called One by One. In the spring of 1862, a man in London, England, named Richard Turner, sat on his son's bed. He held the sick little boy in his arms and spooned some medicine into his mouth. The child swallowed it and then let out a painful cough. Richard's wife, Elizabeth, who was standing by his side, looked at her husband with alarm. It had been a horrific few months for Richard and his family. 2 of their 4 kids had become ill and died of a deadly disease called diphtheria. As their son coughed again, both parents knew he had contracted the disease as well. In the 19th century, diphtheria was a plague across England and Europe. It caused dead tissue to build up in the back of the victim's throat. Eventually, this dead tissue would harden into a thick gray membrane, and it would become impossible for the victim to swallow or breathe. Diphtheria spread rapidly and affected children more than adults. Often, entire city blocks full of kids became sick at the same time. It was highly contagious, painful, and almost always fatal. Worst of all, there was no cure. All the doctors could do was administer a variety of tonics and hope they would reduce the symptoms enough for the patient's body to fight off the disease on its own. The Turners had brought in doctors to try and save their children, but nothing the physicians tried had worked. Now, all Richard and Elizabeth could do was watch helplessly as their third child got paler and weaker from the lack of oxygen. The little boy became delirious and drifted in and out of consciousness. Just 1 week after he got sick, he died in his parents' arms. At the start of the year, they had 4 healthy children. Now they only had 1 child left, a 3-year-old girl named Anne Amelia. The Turners were completely devastated. But they were also perplexed. The rest of their neighborhood seemed untouched by this disease, while only their family was affected. The morning after their son's death, Richard went to work in a haze of grief. Over the next few weeks, they barely slept at night because they were listening for any sign of Anne Amelia getting sick too. Then, late one night, while Richard and Elizabeth were laying in bed, they heard a sound from Anne Amelia's bedroom, a tiny cough and then another. Richard's heart filled with dread. Diphtheria had come for their last child. By breakfast, Anne Amelia was visibly weak. She struggled to swallow her biscuit, and even sipping warm milk was painful. Richard and his wife couldn't just sit by and watch their last child die. There had to be someone in the medical field who could help Anne Amelia. Their neighbor told them about a doctor they'd heard of who was considered one of the best in London. His name was Thomas Orton. If anyone could help their child get better, it was him. The next morning, Richard made his way to the hospital where Dr. Orton practiced. He managed to meet with him and begged the doctor for his help. Initially, Dr. Orton was resistant to the idea. He was extremely busy, and since there was no cure for diphtheria, he was skeptical that he'd actually be able to help them. But Richard would not give up. He pleaded with the doctor to please help what was left of his family. Their daughter's life was at stake. Dr. Orton was moved. He nodded as he shook Richard's hand, and he agreed to help them. The next morning, on April 3rd, 1862, Dr. Orton packed his medical bag and left for the Turner home. The family lived in the Limehouse district, which was one of London's poorest neighborhoods. He wasn't shocked that sickness was prevalent there. The 1800s were a dark time for the entire city. The Industrial Revolution had turned London into a crowded, polluted mess. No matter where you went, it was difficult to escape the stink of raw sewage. Factories spewed toxic black smoke which permanently lingered in the air as a thick haze. Dr. Orton's carriage sped through the dense crowds, past beggars holding out hands for money, many of whom were children. Across the River Thames, trash and dead fish lined the banks. In the Limehouse neighborhood, conditions were even worse. Dr. Orton placed a handkerchief over his nose and mouth to minimize the foul smell of animal waste and rotten food that seemed to be everywhere. When the carriage finally arrived at the Turners' home, Dr. Orton stepped down onto the narrow sidewalk, then he walked to their door, braced himself, and knocked. Richard Turner opened it, looking exhausted and ashen-faced, but he lit up at the sight of this doctor and welcomed him inside. Once Dr. Orton entered the tiny front parlor, he was pleasantly surprised. The home was like an oasis in this hellish neighborhood. It was clean, warm, and well-kept. The Turners brought him into the children's room. A few toys were scattered about on the floor. Colorful drawings hung on bright green wallpaper, and fresh plants were perched on the dresser. Little Anne Amelia sat slumped on the bed against a pillow, covered in heavy blankets. She barely stirred when they entered. Her head hung to the side and her eyes were glassy. Dr. Orton could hear her struggling to breathe. The doctor opened his leather bag and got to work examining the child. He pulled out a tongue depressor and asked Aunt Amelia to open her mouth as wide as she could. When he looked inside to the back of her throat, he was surprised. He couldn't see any signs of a thick gray membrane normally caused by diphtheria. This was unusual, but it also meant that the disease clearly had not progressed as far as he had feared. With treatment, maybe he had time to suppress her symptoms and give her body time to heal itself. He spoon-fed her some opium tincture to ease her discomfort and showed Mrs. Turner how to rub ointment made from coal tar on her daughter's chest. Then he shared his findings with Richard and his wife. He hoped he had gotten to Aunt Amelia's symptoms in time before the diphtheria overwhelmed her. Dr. Orton could see relief wash over the parents' faces. Now all they could do was wait. Over the next 2 weeks, Aunt Amelia did not improve. Even though Dr. Orton checked in on her and her parents tended to her night and day, she still became even weaker. And just before the end of April, the 3-year-old died. The Turners were destroyed. Their entire family had been wiped out in less than 2 months. Dr. Orton's heart broke for them. He felt frustrated and angry. He couldn't get little Aunt Amelia's case out of his head. Something just didn't seem right. The day after Aunt Amelia's death, Dr. Orton sat in his office, poring through his notes. He struggled to make sense of what had happened. Every other doctor the Turners had hired had diagnosed the children with diphtheria, and all signs did point to that being the disease they all had. Except Aunt Amelia's throat had never developed the thick membrane that normally came with diphtheria. Dr. Orton couldn't shake the feeling that something else had killed her and potentially had killed her siblings. It was a crazy thought, but if it was true, that could explain why no one else in their neighborhood had caught the highly contagious disease. Perhaps what killed the Turner children wasn't contagious after all. Dr. Orton was anxious to get more information from the Turners. So just after Aunt Amelia's passing, the doctor returned to their house. Despite their overwhelming grief, the two parents welcomed Dr. Orton inside and they sat together at the kitchen table. He asked them if anything had changed recently at home. He was curious whether they had eaten any new foods or maybe met new people in the area, but the parents said no, nothing has changed. Then the doctor asked if he could check their water source. At that time, families in the Limehouse district retrieved their water from pumps located on the street. People would have to queue up with buckets or tubs and haul whatever they could back home. The doctor inspected the water, and while it was far from clean, he couldn't imagine that it was the cause of their tragedy. And if it was, he didn't understand why other families weren't afflicted as well. Dr. Orton asked the Turners to think of anything else that might have changed in the last several months, anything. Mr. Turner paused and said the only thing he could think of had happened around Christmas. They had saved enough money to buy the kids some new blankets and toys. They had even redecorated their room. The holiday season had been festive and happy, and their good cheer continued into the new year. But then, in February, everything changed. That was when their oldest child fell sick. It happened so fast, and it seemed to come from nowhere. Since then, their lives had been a nightmare. Dr. Orton listened quietly, frustrated that he couldn't glean any clues from what the Turners were sharing. He thanked them as he got up from the table, and then asked if he might take one more look inside the children's room. Richard and his wife nodded. As he walked through the empty room, everything looked the same. The toys were still on the floor, the bed had the same blankets neatly pulled back. Then the doctor's eyes flickered past the pictures on one side of the wall, and that's when he saw something that he had not noticed before. A few hours later, Dr. Orton was sitting at a table in a dimly lit pub just around the corner from his office. Across the table from him was Dr. Henry Letheby, who was a professor of chemistry and taught at the most prestigious hospital in the country, the London Hospital. As they sipped whiskey, Dr. Orton told him about the diphtheria diagnosis of the Turner children. He described how none of the treatments had improved Aunt Amelia's symptoms. Then he described how her throat had never been scarred by the leathery membrane that was so common in diphtheria. Dr. Letheby agreed that a number of things seemed suspicious, but if it wasn't diphtheria, he had no idea what else could have happened. That's when Dr. Orton shared what he had seen in the children's bedroom and why he thought it could explain the tragedy that had fallen on the Turners. Dr. Latheby thought it was a long shot, but he was intrigued by Orton's theory, and he agreed to help him test it. Anne Amelia had not been buried yet, so the next day, Dr. Orton ordered a tissue sample to be taken from her body. Then he sent that sample to Dr. Latheby for analysis. In the meantime, he ran some tests of his own on the unusual thing that he had discovered in the children's bedroom. A few days later, Dr. Latheby and Dr. Orton compared notes. They now understood the cause for the rapid and tragic deaths of the 4 Turner children, and it was not diphtheria. It all started just before Christmas. Richard and his wife wanted to make the children's room as festive as possible to celebrate the holiday season. So one Saturday, they decided to shop for new wallpaper and selected a pattern that the whole family loved. It was intricate and beautiful, and best of all, it was a stunningly bright green. The color was actually called Shayla's green, named after the designer. The shopkeeper told them it was a top seller at their store. When Richard put the paper up on the walls, the room was transformed. The 4 children were overjoyed. In fact, they were so mesmerized by the vivid green wallpaper, they tore off little pieces to play with. Sometimes they would lick it like candy. But what neither the children nor the parents realized was that there was actually a special ingredient in the dye. This ingredient helped to create that very bright green that they all loved so much, and this special ingredient made its way into the children's bodies and traveled through their bloodstreams. It saturated their lungs and caused fluid and mucus to build until one by one, it killed each child. That special ingredient was a deadly poison called arsenic. When Dr. Orton had returned to the children's room days before, he noticed that pieces of the wallpaper were missing. After questioning the Turners about the reason, and them saying their kids were ripping them off and licking them, and then after running tests on Anne Amelia's stomach and then the wallpaper itself, the mystery was solved. At that time, arsenic was used in all kinds of household products, from women's makeup to children's toys to dye for all sorts of fabric, and it was in low enough doses that at the time it was considered safe to touch. But that brand of wallpaper was the exception. Word soon spread across England about what happened to the Turner children. Dr. Orton's discovery sparked a national outrage, and concerned parents protested for the wallpaper to be banned. Dr. Orton campaigned for years until eventually the manufacturing of arsenic-based dyes was stopped. Thanks to Anne Amelia, many children's lives were saved. One morning in the summer of 1876, a doctor named Lewis Allard walked down the hallway of a hospital in Papeete, Tahiti. Tahiti is an island east of Australia. Lewis was just about to step into his office when he heard the hospital doors open, and he looked over to see a few policemen walking in, carrying this unconscious man on a stretcher. Just from the looks of the way this guy was dressed, Dr. Allard could tell he was a sailor. So a lot of Dr. Allard's patients were sailors, because Papeete was a port town. So if people got sick or injured at sea and then docked in Papeete, they would come to the hospital right there. So Dr. Allard walked over to the police and asked them what was going on with the sailor. And the officers explained that this man's friends had found him unresponsive that morning, apparently after a very long night of drinking. Dr. Allard nodded and then motioned for the police to follow him and bring this guy with him, and he led them over to an exam room, where he had them lay out the sailor on a table so that Dr. Allard could look him over. The sailor appeared to be pretty young. He was in his 20s maybe, and he appeared very healthy and strong. But when the doctor checked for a pulse, there was none. And so after checking a couple more times to make sure it wasn't just a very weak pulse, the doctor ultimately concluded that, this sailor was not just unresponsive. The sailor was dead, and if Dr. Allard had to guess, he very likely died from alcohol poisoning, given his friends said, the night before, this guy had had a really heavy night of drinking, and here he was, so alcohol poisoning. So this hospital had a policy for how to handle the death of foreign sailors in Tahiti. Basically, the doctor who pronounced the sailor dead would then arrange for them to be buried in a public cemetery. And in fact, the hospital kept these cheap wooden coffins in the hospital morgue for this exact purpose. And so Dr. Allard followed protocol and asked the police to go inform the sailor's friends of his death, and then the doctor went to the hospital's morgue to arrange for a coffin. A few hours later, Dr. Allard was back in his office when he heard a knock at his door. He told whoever it was to come in, but when the door swung open, the doctor was surprised at who he saw there. It was the 4 local gravediggers who he had called earlier to bury that sailor who had just died. Now, generally speaking, Dr. Allard had virtually no interactions with the gravediggers after he hired them. He would tell them to bury the body, and they would do that and go on their separate way. Like, there was no reason for the gravediggers to come back and check in with the doctor. But as the doctor is looking at these 4 guys trying to figure out what was going on here, he quickly assessed that, these guys weren't here just to chat. They were here because they looked spooked. And before Dr. Allard could ask any questions about, what was going on here, one of these gravediggers began to speak. And in sort of a rapid and sort of anxious tone, he said, as we were carrying the coffin over to the gravesite, it began to shake like the person inside the coffin was alive. And then we heard all these moaning sounds coming from inside of this nailed shut coffin. And we all got so panicked that we just dropped the coffin and we ran here to tell you. Now, Dr. Allard was pretty surprised by what he was hearing, but he's also thinking that, when he hired these 4 gravediggers, they were at a local pub and they were drinking. And so he's thinking to himself, maybe something strange happened, with this coffin, or much more likely, these 4 guys are drunk, and that what they've sort of said here is just some figment of their imagination, that they're not professional, they're just drunk guys who are coming here screwing up my day. And so sort of annoyed, Dr. Allard's like, hey, I'm telling you, that guy is dead, okay? This isn't a ghost scenario, but if you're so worried about it, why don't you go get a police officer, have them come over and inspect the coffin, make sure the person is really dead in there, and then once they confirm that, please do your job and bury this guy. And so the gravediggers, they kind of, look down sort of awkwardly and they're like, okay, we'll go do that. And they turned and they left. And then Dr. Allard got back to work. And then a few hours later, Dr. Allard heard another knock on his door. And this time when the door opened, it was a police officer. And it was actually the officer that the 4 gravediggers had gone and found at Dr. Allard's suggestion. And he had gone over, checked the coffin, and the coffin wasn't moving, it wasn't making any weird sounds, it was sealed shut, there was nothing going on. And so the officer eventually instructed the gravediggers, to go ahead and bury it, there's nothing going on here. And so the gravediggers had, at that point, buried the coffin, and that had been that. And so the officer was here just to tell Dr. Allard that, hey, it's all good, he's buried, we can move on. About a week later, Dr. Allard had basically forgotten about this whole snafu around the coffin and whatever was going on with it. He was sort of on to the next thing, and he was out like he normally was at night to go for a walk. And the area that he liked to walk in the most was actually the cemetery. Not because he had some sort of morbid obsession, but because, it was often, vacant. There was nobody there. And so it was a peaceful place to go walking. And so, he's strolling through the cemetery like usual, and he's not seeing anybody like usual. But as it began to get dark, he was walking down this one row of headstones, and he looked up ahead, and he could have sworn he saw somebody standing behind a tree with their body sort of half out of the tree, half behind the tree, sort of half obscured. And he stopped and he's looking, and the whole thing just sort of felt off. Like, what is this person doing? Is that a person? Like, what's going on here? And so he's staring, and as he's looking, sure enough, this dark silhouette steps out from behind this tree. And the way they stepped out, it was like they stepped out, turned, and faced Dr. Allard, and just stood there, clearly looking right at Dr. Allard. But they're pretty far away from Dr. Allard, like there's a good distance between them. But immediately, Dr. Allard felt threatened by this person, or whatever it was. He didn't even know if it was a person. He couldn't tell if it was his mind playing tricks on him or not. He's just staring at this thing that looked like it was looking at him. And so Dr. Allard instinctively, who's now feeling a little bit frightened, turned and just started walking away, like he was done walking in the cemetery for the night. And so he turns and he starts walking, but then it's like the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He just felt like this person, whoever it is, they're still watching me.
And so he stopped after just a couple of steps and he turned back around. And now this figure is clearly marching directly towards Dr. Allard. They're almost running. They're walking real fast right towards Dr. Allard. And so now Dr. Allard's terrified. He knows there's something happening here. Why would this person be doing this? Like, is it a person? Like, what's happening here? And so Dr. Allard, he turns and starts to run. And as he's running, he hears this horrible high-pitched scream echo across the entire cemetery. And then he looks back one last time and he sees the face of this figure, this person charging towards him. And it's the same guy who died a week ago, the same sailor that he buried, the one who presumably was moving around in the coffin the gravediggers were so scared of. It was him, and he jumped on Dr. Allard and began throttling him. And Dr. Allard's on the ground staring at this ghastly face. The scream is coming out of him. He had no idea what was going on. And then Dr. Allard just blacked out. A few minutes later, Dr. Allard came to, and he sat up suddenly and he's looking around, and there's nobody there. It's just a dark, vacant cemetery. No sign of the dead sailor's ghost or whatever, or whoever it was. They're gone. And Dr. Allard's just sitting there, his heart's racing still, and he's telling himself, like, did that even just happen? Like, it felt so real. His neck was sore from, what he felt was this guy, this thing attacking him. But at the same time, he was so sure that the face that he had seen on this person was the dead sailor's face. But how could that be? He's dead. He's buried. How could that be? And so ultimately, Dr. Allard, he got up and he hustled back to his house. But over the coming weeks, Dr. Allard sort of spiraled into madness. Because it was like every day, all the time, he would see out of the corner of his eye for a second, like a glimpse of this dead sailor's ghost. And it was always that face, that ghastly face, that shrieking face looking right at him. And he'd turn and the face would disappear. But Dr. Allard, he just felt like he was almost being haunted, that something had happened, like that attack in the cemetery. It had felt so real. He felt like now this ghost was literally haunting him. But he couldn't tell anyone. I mean, he's a doctor. What's he gonna do? Tell people that a ghost is haunting him? He didn't know what to do. And so what he ended up doing after several weeks is he just began staying home and laying in bed, basically feigning illness to avoid leaving the house. And he would just lay there with his eyes closed basically all day, because as soon as he opened his eyes, he would see this dead sailor's face. He really was losing his mind. And then eventually, when Dr. Allard knew he had to stop basically staying in bed all day and go back to the hospital and sort of function in society again, go back to work, otherwise people were gonna start asking questions here, like, what's going on with you? And he didn't have an answer, When that time came and he knew it was sort of like, okay, go back to normal or tell people about this. Well, what Dr. Allard ultimately did is he decided to walk up to the roof of his house and throw himself off. He literally couldn't live with what he believed was this ghost haunting him 24/7. When the doctor's close friends found out that the doctor had taken his own life, they immediately went to the police and said, hey, wait a minute, we think this has something to do with what he was dealing with over the past several weeks. So the doctor, despite not wanting to tell anybody about, his haunting, he did sort of begin to tell a couple of his close friends. Now, he was sort of subtle about it, but he began telling people that he's like, yeah, I keep seeing that dead sailor's face everywhere I go. I just keep seeing him. Now, he didn't highlight the fact that he was basically losing his mind over it and thought it was literally a ghost. But a couple of his close friends were aware that it almost seemed like, Dr. Allard was effectively having a mental breakdown over this dead sailor. And they did sort of connect that Dr. Allard sort of felt haunted by this dead sailor. And so, said close friends ultimately went to the police and said, hey, I know this is a stretch, but the doctor kind of thought he was being haunted by this dead sailor before he died. We think that has to do with why he took his own life. And sort of amazingly, the police, the way they responded to this was, okay, we're gonna look into this. We're gonna investigate the haunting, so to speak. And what they did is they exhumed the coffin of that dead sailor. They didn't know what else to do. They just decided they would do that. And so they raised the coffin out of the ground and they open it up and they cannot believe what they see. So it would turn out those 4 gravediggers had been totally justified in being scared about what they thought they heard and felt in that coffin when they were going to bury it. Because the sailor was not dead. He was just so drunk that it felt like he was dead. They couldn't feel his pulse. Dr. Allard had been wrong. The sailor was not dead. He was totally alive. And so as he was being carried over to the gravesite to be buried, he really was moving around inside the coffin and moaning because he was horribly hungover, but totally alive and, grappling with the fact that he's now, confined inside of this coffin. He likely had no idea what was going on, so you can imagine the types of sounds and things he might be doing. And so the gravediggers, they were right to be scared. They did get a police officer. The police officer came over, and for whatever reason, when he inspected the coffin, he saw it was sealed. There was no movement inside the coffin. It was totally quiet. So, the sailor inside, he just wasn't moving or making any sound. And so the police officer greenlit burying him. So the living sailor inside the coffin is buried underground by these gravediggers, and they go their separate ways afterwards. But then that sailor wakes up again. He begins thrashing around after being buried in the ground. And he actually managed to break out of the coffin and climb out of the ground. He saved himself. He literally, survived being buried alive. But he was furious at the doctor, who so cavalierly just decided he was dead and I'll go bury him. And so he decided he would play a prank on the doctor to get back at him. So what he did is he filled his coffin up with rocks and he sealed it back up and he reburied it so nobody would know anything. And then for the next week or so, he just kind of hid out and didn't let anybody know that he was actually still alive. And then, after about a week, he knew the doctor took his walks in that cemetery, and so he hid behind a tree in the cemetery and waited for the doctor to be alone making his walk. And when he saw him, it was the sailor, fully alive in the flesh, stepping out from behind the tree, looking at the doctor. That was him. It really was the sailor. And he really did run forward, shrieking, pretending to be a ghost. And he attacked Dr. Allard, basically giving him the impression that his angry ghost was attacking him. And then after Dr. Allard passed out on the ground, the sailor ran off. But for Dr. Allard, who fully believed that sailor was dead, can you imagine what he thought when he saw, the sailor attacking him and shrieking in the middle of the cemetery? He fully believed that was the sailor's ghost, and he had this totally real experience getting attacked by the ghost. And so even though he survived the encounter, it drove him mad. He began seeing the dead sailor, the ghost, everywhere he went, and it eventually drove him to kill himself. And so when the police opened up that coffin, all they saw were all the rocks the sailor had left behind. But following the doctor's suicide, that sailor apparently skipped town and was never seen again. On the night of August 30th, 1892, a 20-year-old man named Benjamin Trudell climbed into his bed inside of the Deer Park Life-Saving Station, which was a small government building right off the coast of Lake Superior in Michigan. Benjamin was a member of the Life-Saving Service, which was a precursor to the US Coast Guard, and he was currently working overnight as a surfman, which was basically like a lifeguard, but specifically for ships that were out on the lake. He was there with a bunch of other surfmen who were all taking shifts, either sleeping, patrolling the beach, or staying awake inside the station in case somebody came looking for help. Benjamin had just finished a 4-hour beach patrol, which had been pretty uneventful, but at the same time, he was still walking around for 4 hours on loose sand, and so he was pretty tired. And so now that he was back at the station, he had a little bit of time where he could basically take a nap. And so he set his alarm for 4 hours later, which is when he would need to be awake in the station to take on another shift. And then he told his fellow surfmen that he was gonna close his eyes for a minute. And then he climbed into bed and fell asleep. A few hours later, though, Ben shot up in bed and began frantically looking around the room. He was covered in sweat, his heart was racing, and after a second, he realized that, he's okay. He's in the station, he's safe, and what had just happened to him was just a dream. He had had a terrifying nightmare, but it had felt so real that it really took him a second to, understand that that's all it had been, just a dream. In this dream, Benjamin was walking along the coast of Lake Superior, like he did during his nightly beach patrol, and it was dark out and there was this awful thunderstorm, and the rain was coming down so hard that Benjamin could barely see, and in fact he almost felt like the impacts of the individual raindrops almost hurt his skin, like they were acid striking his skin. Then suddenly, through this wall of rain right in front of him, this man who Ben didn't recognize kind of stumbled into view. And this man was wearing very nice clothing, like he was on his way to a party or something. But, they're down at the coast of this lake and it's storming out, like it didn't make any sense. But Benjamin, he just stared at the sky and didn't say anything. And the guy looked right back at Benjamin, and without saying a word, he just reached out and really aggressively shook Benjamin's hand. And then, as Benjamin is watching his hand be shaken around by this guy with wild eyes turns and he points out to the lake that's right next to them. And even though he didn't say anything, he pointed with this level of urgency, like there's something out there, something bad, and you need to pay attention to whatever it is. And so Benjamin, he turned, and his hand's still being shaken by this guy, and he looks out, but it's just a wall of water. He can't even see the lake, and he has no idea what this guy is trying to tell him. And it was at that point that, Benjamin sat up and he was awake again. Now, objectively, Benjamin understood that while this dream definitely was creepy, it wasn't really terrifying. It was raining and storming and a random guy came up and shook his hand and pointed at the lake. Like that's not terrifying. But for some reason for Benjamin, it just felt so real that was the thing that made it so unsettling. It felt like he really had been out there and really had this interaction. Now, Benjamin was not the type of guy that would, find meaning in dreams. He basically chalked dreams up as just that, just dreams. But there was something different about this dream. He felt almost intuitively like what had just happened in his dream was a warning. That man, whoever he was telling Benjamin something, and it had to do with the lake, but he didn't know what it was. But as Benjamin thought about this, he knew how sort of crazy that sounded. And he figured that maybe he was just kind of caught up in the immediacy of having just had this dream, that really the only reason he felt like it had weight is because it just happened. And so maybe if he just went outside and got some fresh air and let some time pass, that he would, let this dream fade into the ether and he'd go back to normal life. And sure enough, when he got outside and got some fresh air, he did feel better. But he did still feel like that dream meant something. And so he just walked down to the coast of Lake Superior, where he was in his dream, to the other surfmen who were down there doing their own patrol. And there, there was nothing unusual happening. The lake, it was so calm. And Benjamin, he went up to one of the surfmen and just kind of told them about this dream. And he was almost joking about it. He's like, yeah, it felt so real that I almost feel like it was a warning of some kind. But yeah, it's just a dream. And the other surfmen who were listening just were like, yeah, that's crazy dream, huh? And that was it. The following day, around noon, Benjamin and his fellow surfmen were hanging out inside the life-saving station when all of a sudden, this guy comes stumbling into the station and he looked awful. He was soaking wet, he was covered in all these cuts and bruises, and he was visibly shaking so much that it almost looked like he was about to collapse right there onto the floor. Benjamin immediately asked the guy, like, hey, what's going on? What's brought you here? What's happening? And the man, who clearly was struggling to just breathe at this point, sort of composed himself and just said, I was out on the lake last night on a ship that sunk. And as soon as he said that, Benjamin was like in total disbelief, because if a ship sunk on Lake Superior, the life-saving service that Benjamin was a part of was supposed to know, because they patrolled the lake and tracked the vessels out on the water. So it seems sort of impossible that a ship could sink and his crew, the surfmen, would somehow not even know about it. And then, at the same time Benjamin is thinking this, he couldn't help but go back to that dream he had had. It had happened last night, and it just seemed like this guy was warning Benjamin about something out on the lake. It just seemed way too coincidental that this guy's here the next day talking about a shipwreck out on the lake around the same time frame. The survivor of this shipwreck explained that the ship had been really far out on the lake, probably too far away from shore for them to even see. And he said that he and several other people had made it onto a lifeboat, but the boat had capsized. And he had spent hours and hours swimming to shore, and he had just gotten here, and that's why he'd come in, and he was soaking wet and so tired because he had just swam all night. And he said he didn't know about any of the other survivors or if there were any other survivors. All he knew is that he was here and he has no idea what else happened. And so Benjamin and the other surfmen immediately gave this man a blanket and some food and some water, and then they quickly sent out a fleet of boats to go search the lake to hopefully find other victims of the shipwreck. That evening and all through the night, Benjamin and his co-workers sailed rescue boats back and forth all across Lake Superior, looking for survivors, but all they could find were 4 dead bodies. But the man who had swam to shore and told them about the shipwreck said there had to be more people out there. He said there had been 27 people on this ship, including him, when it had sunk, which meant a lot of people were still definitely unaccounted for. So while some of the surfmen continued to search out on the water, Benjamin and a small team decided they would actually search the coastline itself and see if anybody washed up on shore. And so early on the morning of September 1st, so now the surfmen have been out searching for people for over 24 hours at this point, Benjamin and his team were walking down the coastline and they looked up ahead and they saw what appeared to be 2 people laying on the sand. And so of course they ran up to them, and unfortunately they discovered that, it was a man and a woman who were lying face down in the sand, and they were not breathing. They were dead. And so Ben, he knelt down next to the man and he began rolling his body over to get a look at him. And when he did that, 2 things happened. When he rolled him over and actually got a look at this guy's face, he saw immediately that it was the exact same guy from his dream. The guy who had shaken his hand and pointed out at the lake. It was him, definitely. And as he's having this revelation and he's sort of kneeling there in shock, the man's body, he's sort of rolling it over, and as it completes the rollover, the man's limp hand falls directly onto Ben's hand, like a handshake. Ben would later learn that the ship that sunk out on Lake Superior the night before was called the Western Reserve, and apparently it had sunk during the exact same time that Ben had that nightmare. And the man that Ben saw in his dream, the man that had been pointing out at the lake and shaking his hand in the dream, and then Ben found on the shore dead, who then in his death flopped over and put his hand in his hand all over again, was a guy named Robert Minch, and he was part owner of the Western Reserve ship. For the rest of Benjamin's life, he believed that Robert's spirit had actually visited him in that nightmare to warn him about the shipwreck that was literally happening right then and there. That he was shaking his hand and pointing out at the lake like, hey, go out there right now. There's something horrible happening. A ship is sinking. People need your help. But when Benjamin woke up, despite really feeling like this meant something, this dream was a warning, he didn't actually go out and search the lake. And so as a result, the ship sank. In fact, of the 27 people who were on board that ship that sank, 26 died, including Robert, the owner. The only survivor was that man who swam to shore and told them after the shipwreck had already happened. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1989, a 70-year-old man named Jim Moore and his wife Clara walked along the beach on a tiny island off the coast of South Carolina. It was called Pawleys Island, and it was less than 4 miles long and only wide enough to fit one main road with beachfront houses on either side. Jim and Clara lived in one of those beachfront houses, and every afternoon they would go out and walk the beach together. That particular day, as they walked, Jim could see some clouds gathering off in the distance, right above the ocean. And he'd actually seen a weather report recently about this big storm called Hurricane Hugo that was supposed to be heading their way in the next couple of days. Living on an island, Jim and Clara were pretty used to getting warnings like that. I mean, storms were sort of a big deal on an island because you're pretty isolated. And they were just planning to evacuate if the weather, got pretty bad. But for now, it did seem like the weather wasn't too bad, so they were sticking it out. However, it did sort of seem like basically everybody else on Pawleys Island had taken the storm a little bit more seriously, and most of them had already evacuated. And in fact, as Jim and Clara are walking, normally they would see lots of people out doing what they were doing, walking the beach, but today, there was just one person really far down the beach, just this one guy walking towards them, but that was it. The rest of the beach was basically deserted. But Jim and Clara were, veterans of Pawleys Island and certainly veterans of other storms that they had weathered in the past, and so they weren't worried yet. And they just continued to, walk down the beach and chat and just kind of stare out at these growing clouds and just have a normal day. But as they're walking, Jim was sort of keeping an eye on this guy, this one other guy on the beach that was walking towards them. Now, he wasn't literally walking towards them. He was just sort of walking in the other direction. And so inevitably, both Jim and Clara and this guy were going to pass each other. And as Jim got closer to this guy, he realized he actually didn't recognize him. And realistically, Polly's Island was so small that Jim and Clara basically knew everybody, or at least could recognize everybody. But this guy, who was wearing this long gray coat and this wide-brimmed hat, and he kind of had his head down, Jim didn't recognize. And he told Clara, like, hey, who is this guy? As they're walking closer and closer, and she's like, I don't know, I've never seen him before. But, there was no cause for alarm here. It's broad daylight, and who cares if there's a stranger on the island? I mean, of course, people that live here have guests all the time. Like, this is probably just somebody visiting somebody who lives here. And so they're walking, getting closer and closer. And then finally, when Jim and Clara were about, 10 feet away from this guy, the guy in the big gray coat, Jim, to be polite, just said, hey, how you doing? Because they're the only people on the beach. You can't just ignore each other. But the guy in the gray coat, he just kept that big hat sort of angled down and just briskly walked right past Jim and Clara and didn't even acknowledge them, which is like, there's nobody else here. What are you doing? It's sort of rude. And so Jim and Clara, they look at each other like, that's weird. They keep on walking. And then for whatever reason, Jim just turns around and looks towards this guy, the guy who had just passed them, the guy in the gray coat. And when he looked, he just stopped because the guy was gone and there's nowhere to go. There is no, shrubs or trees or anything. This is a wide open, flat beach. And this guy has just passed Jim and Clara like seconds ago. He can't be anywhere else. He has to be on the beach. There's nowhere to hide. And so Jimmy grabs Clara and he's like, look, he's gone. And she turns around and she's like, what's going on? That's not possible. And they're looking like, did he go in the ocean? But they're looking out in the water and there's no sign of him. The only place, maybe he could have gone is if as soon as he passed by Jim and Clara, he hard turned and ran inland and hid, behind one of the houses. But that's pretty far away. It just didn't seem possible that in that short of an amount of time, he could get up there and hide. And also, why would you do that? That's such bizarre behavior. And so Jim and Clara, they're just standing there like trying to come up with some reasonable theory to explain where this guy went, but they just couldn't do it. It was like this guy just disappeared. And so eventually, Jim and Clara just had to turn back around and finish their walk and make their way home. And the whole time, all they could talk about was this disappearing man in the gray coat, because it defied any rational explanation. Where did he go? When the couple finally got back to their house, by this point, the clouds that had been gathering outside were now very dark, and it really did seem like a serious storm was on the horizon. And then when they turned on the TV, they put on the Weather Channel, and there was this bulletin that the South Carolina state government had actually issued an evacuation order to all inhabitants of Polly's Island, because apparently Hurricane Hugo was getting bigger and faster and more destructive, and it appeared like Polly's Island was clearly going to be in the path of this hurricane. And so at this point, Jim and Clara forgot about the gray man and realized like, hey, we got to pack our stuff up and go. We thought we had maybe a day or two before we'd have to evacuate, but no more. We got to go right now. And fortunately for them, they actually had an adult daughter who lived right on mainland South Carolina. And so they could stay with her on short notice, no problem. And so they quickly packed up, they hopped in their car, and they drove on the one main road until they hit the bridge that went over the ocean. They made their way across the bridge onto mainland South Carolina and over to their daughter's house. And once they got there, their daughter was obviously very happy to see them, happy they were safe. And they would just spend the whole day basically just sitting there with the Weather Channel on, watching reports about Hurricane Hugo. And over the course of the day, the news got more and more dire. Hurricane Hugo was poised to be this enormous, destructive storm that was not slowing down at all. And unfortunately, Polly's Island was really looking like one of the main areas that was going to be affected by this storm. In fact, the meteorologist was saying, like, it is not safe to be on the island at this point. I mean, there's a chance that all the structures on the island could be leveled by the end of this storm. So Jim and Clara, they're obviously happy they are safe, on mainland South Carolina with their daughter, but they live on that island. Their house, everything they own, it's on that island. And so the idea that they were just helpless and their house is going to be destroyed was sort of just terrible. Like, what can you even do? You're helpless. And so as they began to sort of spiral into all their anxieties around what's going to happen, eventually one of them said, hey, let's just accept that we're in this position and let's just change the subject. We're safe here. Don't worry about what the storm's going to do. Let's just change the subject. And the first subject that was raised was Jim and Clara's encounter with that strange disappearing man in the gray cloak. And so Jim and Clara, they told the story to their daughter about this weird guy they saw and how he just kind of vanished. And their daughter was like really interested listening to the story. And when they were done telling it, she looked at her parents and was like, I think you might have seen the gray man. Now, Jim and Clara had lived on Polly's Island long enough to know about the legend of the Gray Man. As the story goes, 150 years earlier, there was this sailor who was making his way to Polly's Island to see his fiancée who was there. And when he got to the island, he unfortunately basically fell into quicksand and died. And so the fiancée is totally heartbroken. She's basically losing her mind over the sudden loss of her love. But a couple of days after her fiancé, the sailor, had died, she saw him walking on the beach on Polly's Island. And he was wearing this long gray coat and this big wide-brimmed hat. And he was walking towards her and she was so overjoyed. She knows it doesn't make any sense, but she runs to her beloved sailor, and right as she reaches him, he disappears. Now, Jim and Clara, they couldn't help but see the overlap here. I mean, they saw, a guy wearing a long gray coat with a big wide-brimmed hat who, was walking on the beach, who then disappeared. It did sort of seem like the legend of the Gray Man, but neither Jim nor Clara really felt like that actually was the explanation here. But at the same time, Jim did feel like, man, that is a weird coincidence. Over the next couple of days, Hurricane Hugo made landfall, and it was absolutely vicious. And then finally, when it passed and it was safe to go back to Polly's Island, Jim and Clara loaded up their car, they said bye to their daughter, and they made the drive out there. And as they were crossing the bridge to get out to Polly's Island, along with all the other inhabitants that were going back, they immediately could tell that Polly's Island really had been leveled. I mean, the roads themselves were badly damaged, there were street signs and trees everywhere, and as they're getting closer, they can see that basically their whole community has been leveled. All the buildings are destroyed. I mean, it's like a war zone. Now, Jim and Clara had sort of braced themselves for this because they had heard on the news that sure enough, this hurricane had been as bad as expected and Polly's Island had taken a direct hit. And so they drove across the island until they reached their property. And when they got to their property, they could not believe what they saw. So there's actually one more part to the legend of the Gray Man ghost. And that is when the woman saw who she believed was her dead fiancé walking up the beach with his gray coat and his big brimmed hat, and she runs up and he disappears and it's so tragic. That's not the end of the story, because the woman was so upset by seeing what she thought was her fiancé again. He's back from the dead, oh my goodness, and then he vanishes. It's like she had to experience his death a second time, and it made her go crazy. It was like so much grief. It was so overwhelming that she couldn't live with it. And in fact, quickly after seeing, his ghost disappear, she was sent off the island to a hospital. She was basically institutionalized. And while she was off the island, immediately after she left the island, this huge storm rolled through and leveled Polly's Island. And only one building survived. It was her house. Inexplicably, her house was untouched, completely untouched. Everybody else's ruined. So keep that in mind, because when Jim and Clara returned to Polly's Island following Hurricane Hugo, whose house was the only house left standing? Theirs. Utterly untouched. Their neighbors' houses, all the local businesses, everything gone. Their house, untouched. And just so you know, the legend of the Gray Man, people believe if you see the Gray Man, he's warning you to leave the island in advance of a storm, like he apparently did for his fiancée. He warned her, get off the island. And if you heed his warning, the legend goes, your house will be spared. And people believe that's exactly what happened to Jim and Clara.
Same road home, same city lights, red lights changing through the windshield at night. The seat beside me stays untouched, but somehow it still feels occupied. Time kept moving, street kept moving, street after street. But some memories never miss a beat. still sit.
You ever love something that hurts you gently? Yeah, the kind. You said my name like it was safe to stay. Soft tone hiding what you take away. Your smile felt warm, your silence was cold. I learned your truth and the things you didn't hold. I read your eyes like a warning sign. Still cross the line every single time. You touch my scars like you knew the code. Then blame my heart for the weight you broke. I called it love, it felt like gravity pulling me down, but it felt like destiny. I knew the damage still stayed inside.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time,